All right. And now that I've recorded with all of that, I will pass off the introduction to Zach Martinez, Wolf and Company's Senior Business Development Manager.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today. My name is Zach Martinez. I'm the senior manager for our healthcare niche here at Wolf& Company. Today, I'm joined by our strategic leader and principal of Wolf's AI practice, Nelson Abondo. I'll pass the microphone to Nelson to kick things off. Thanks again.
Thanks, Zach. Welcome, everybody. The Wolf team is excited to present our AI governance presentation today around giving best practices about scaling your AI programs. So just a little background from me. Wolf's AI services principal. I lead our artificial intelligence practice, have been in the technology and management consulting space for the past 20 years. Previous stops at Dell Technologies, Hitachi Vantara, and Capital One. We focus on specializing advisory services throughout the AI lifecycle, specifically focusing on strategy, governance, enablement, and risk management. So for today's presentation, we have a couple of agenda topics that we'd like to walk through with. Here you'll see we'll start off with kind of laying the lay of the land for the healthcare industry and establishing kind of what makes healthcare a little bit different than other industries where AI is making its impact right now. We'll talk about best case principles around holistic AI governance and break down how the AI use case should be used as a control event to start off the entire journey when you're thinking about ideating, building, deploying AI solutions, and what's a practical way in order to set up or stand up an AI lifecycle framework if your organization doesn't have one, or how you can scale it up or modify it if it's missing certain aspects. We'll then tie that into what establishes a scalable risk management framework, right? Today's discussion is going to focus in on the AI lifecycle framework, but really that's kind of one small, one large piece of a risk management program around AI solutions. So we'll talk about how you build that maturity as well. And then we'll leave you with some practical tips that when you take back to your organization, how do we begin to evaluate progress and how can we make some incremental steps towards a scalable program. So let's start with the healthcare tech context. So AI solutions are in every industry right now, right? They're all over the headlines. I'm sure they're within your organizations as well. One thing to keep in mind is that healthcare is very different than other low impact, low regulated industries, right? The slide here captures kind of like the four key pillars that we need to keep in mind when we're deploying AI solutions, right? One is that our solutions and outcomes have real world impacts to our patients, right? So patient safety has to always be critical when you're designing an AI solution and making strategic discussions or decisions around what's the risk profile of it, what's the expected return on investment, and kind of what's going to be that patient experience, right? So that's very a sensitive topic as far as just from a organization perspective, but societal, right? Clinical trust and adoption, right? Healthcare is one of those industries where it has a lot of specialized subject matter expertise, right? We're dealing with clinicians, physicians, operations, as well as administrative staff supporting the healthcare lifecycle. In order to deploy a successful AI solution or tool, we need to gain their trust with whatever we're building, right? So making sure that we're emphasizing and focusing on the right data that's being used, as well as that end user experience, and making sure that the outputs are accurate, all lead to successful buy-in and enablement for the different end users of AI solutions. As I mentioned, healthcare also has a number of regulatory considerations. There's still a number of AI frameworks and guidance going around, obviously with HIPAA data, but then also kind of what is ethical AI, and how is it being used in some of the decisioning or recommendations it's giving around patient care or other use cases, right? So as that landscape changes, both from an industry perspective, a state and federal perspective, we need to continue to tie in those inputs into our AI decisions and monitoring capabilities. And finally, healthcare is also an area where we rely on a lot of vendors, right? There's a lot of health tech vendors and solutions coming up in the ecosystem. So when you think about building an AI lifecycle framework, for your AI governance programs, vendors play a key part, right? Because what we don't want to have is an ecosystem of 20 new AI vendors that are all not being managed in a consistent fashion, with different risk factors and criteria, right? So vendors providing AI solutions or integrating into our EHRs or other ecosystems is going to be a key critical point as we go throughout the AI lifecycle. So before we jump in, I'd love to just level set for those who have access to the chat aspect of the Zoom webinar right now. If people could just type in really quickly, like the number of AI solutions or systems that you've already begun to be exposed to within your organization. This sometimes helps us set kind of like where everyone is from an exposure or maturity perspective. And it could be people who are just starting off and it's zero, or it could be people that have already experienced it, with kind of 5 AI solutions or plus 10. But if you're able to, if you could just jot down kind of a number of AI solutions that you've been exposed to within your organization. And if it's zero, I mean, that's totally fine too. But we'd love to kind of hear from you. All
I'm
right.
seeing 5+ in the webinar chat right now. A couple people saying 1, a couple people saying 2.
Okay. So a handful, right? That's great. Not far from what we were expecting, right? I think healthcare is one of those industries, right, that is moving a little faster than say financial services or other specific industries, and that's just because there is so much potential upside when it comes to AI kind of really impacting key scenarios within the healthcare system. So we'll talk about some of those domains a little later, but definitely wanted to gauge the audience to see kind of where we are on our maturity journey. So thank you for that. All right, so let's go to the next slide now. So what's changing in healthcare AI, right? So digital tools, predictive analytics is nothing new to healthcare, right? What we're seeing now over the past year with the rise of agentic AI solutions is now kind of moving away from the chatbot engagement or predictive next best action for clinicians and really getting more into kind of orchestration and automation of multi-step workflows, right? And that's because of the rise of agentic AI solutions becoming a lot more mainstream and reliable. Now, with that increased capability comes bigger onus on us as governing bodies of those AI solutions to make sure that we're accounting for the proper rights, data, and outputs that all those new agents are producing, right? But we are definitely seeing a shift in agentic AI exploration when it comes to healthcare systems and healthcare providers and even health tech vendors in some of the solutions that they're offering to their constituents. And why this matters? Because the days of like trying to pick like what's the best model or what's the best chatbot to help out with my organization is now being replaced with a lot more complex workflow of, hey, we actually have multiple models integrated into a workflow with multiple handoffs happening across our departments. How do we make sure that the right controls and data security are navigating through each step? And how do we have that traceability and auditability of those solutions from a regulator and risk compliance perspective, right? So we're getting new capabilities, but at the same time, it's making our jobs from a governance perspective harder because now the footprint is expanding, right? And it has a lot more touch points and it can quickly get out of hand if we don't have the proper controls and risk considerations thought through from the beginning, right? And that's where the AI lifecycle comes into place as far as thinking it through some of those decisions in a step-by-step process. All right. So why does AI governance keep failing at scale? The reality is even though we all know that governance should be top of mind, it's one of those topics that really, sometimes gets kicked down the road, right? We saw this in the data governance boom 10 years ago when data lakes and data scientists were coming up. We knew that the data aspect of predictive analytics and ML and conventional AI was reliant on that. But yet, from a data governance perspective, it was still something that we saw as a massive, effort, right? And the same thing is applying to AI governance now, right? So what we've seen over the past 18 months is a lot of pilots, a lot of experimentation. And with that, you see some of these kind of failure points that have happened, right? So fragmented oversight, right? A specific department or a physician or a clinical leader wanted to try out a new AI vendor tool. They had the budget, they proceeded with it, but it wasn't really centralized. They didn't have all the right constituents involved in that decision. And then sometimes they didn't talk to each other, right? So in bigger organizations, you see this now scattered, graveyard of past failed vendor pilots around AI and AI experimentation, right? So there was fragmented oversight. With that comes unclear accountability. So just because the budget owner paid for that vendor solution, are they truly accountable for it, right? How are they ensuring or making sure that the outputs are reliable and aligned to regulatory considerations or our risk profile, right? Some of these questions weren't answered kind of at that initial procurement stage. At the same time, this also leads to inconsistent controls, right? Without a life cycle governance framework, someone who has one AI solution in a certain department or area may be managing it differently and monitoring different KPIs than a different person, right? So we need to come to this centralized cross-functional governance framework where we're all being a lot more consistent and governance isn't an afterthought, right? And we're seeing this now because over the past year and a half, like I said, it was the phase or age of exploration and experimentation. And lacking those governance controls is fine when you're only managing, one AI solution, three AI solutions. But as the maturity of your programs evolve, you're going to be handling, plus 10, plus 20. And once you bring agentic AI into it, that scales even faster, right? So making sure that you have the right frameworks and controls from the beginning is the way to get a handle on the sprawl that's currently happening. So when we say holistic AI governance, like how do we remediate some of these, issues? It's a new kind of way of thinking, right? Because the traditional model of IT solutions or software that we used, within the healthcare industry kind of was always snapshots and point in times, right? And now with AI, we need to think of governance and risk management by being a lot more on a continuous time scale, right? It's not just at the end of every quarter, at the end of each year for our audits. We're getting into a space where we're having, autonomous AI solutions in some cases making real-time decisions throughout the day. So even having a day, a week, a month without having the right controls could lead to catastrophic consequences if it's not controlled right, right? So we have some principles that people need to begin thinking as you set up your AI governance framework, right? It needs to be lifecycle embedded, right? So this goes as far as making sure governance is a process, right? It's not a check the box exercise at the end of an implementation. Governance needs to be thought through at each step of each phase gate, right? Accountability first, right? Let's not wait till the end of the solution before it's deployed to really understand like who's going to own it, who's going to be accountable, who are the end users. All those constituents need to be brought along as that AI solution is identified, designed, deployed, tested, and then even in production as it's monitored, right? So making sure we always have accountability for all our AI solutions. Audit ready. Once again, this is becoming a convergence, right? Where our risk and our audit groups used to go back and forth with this, power struggle with IT and the business. Now we're seeing with the complexity of AI solutions, all those parties need to work together in a cross-functional space in order to be caught up and make sure that we're all on the same page of possible exposure points or considerations that we need to make so that we have the audit trail and are audit ready by the time it hits the production window. And like I said, right, a key best practice is also, making sure that all these discussions are cross-functional. So a lot of organizations we talk to, still have AI as a capability contained within IT. Obviously, the best practices is as you evolve your organization and operating models, is that it should be a cross-functional entity, right? AI has outgrown being contained just by just from IT from a technology perspective, right? They may manage the systems, they may manage the data, but holistically, we need to have counterparts from the business, from risk, compliance, and other stakeholders to make sure that everyone is informed of what we're actually designing and building and what's going to be rolled out to our clinician staff, doctors, providers, and so forth. So those are kind of principles as you think about kind of building up your lifecycle framework that may be a little different of how you thought about governance or risk management in the past, with IT systems or other solutions. All right, so let's start off with the starting point, right? The use case. An AI use case, just from a terminology perspective, if you haven't come across it, is basically, identifying and defining kind of what you want to solve or what is the pain point you're looking to address within your organization and how AI is going to solve that problem, right? So we need to use the use case as the control event because it starts with that, right? We got into a bad habit of going after the shiny toy or being persuaded by a vendor presentation of all the different possibilities of what AI could do. And what we saw in the past year now is that not everything returns the return on investment that we expected or thought about, or even the end user adoption, right? So now in this new frame mode, right, we need to really give more rigor to what are we trying to solve and how does it actually tie back to our organization's strategic priorities, right? Our goals around patient experience, operations efficiency, and whatever other, North Star guiding principles the organization has laid out. So the use case at the same time, after identifying kind of what it's supposed to do or what it's solving, can also be used to then inform us with kind of its risk posture, right? Not all use cases are created equal, right? An AI summarization scribing solution is not as impactful or as risky as an AI solution that's going to give, medical diagnoses or recommendation advice to actual patients, right? Those are opposite spectrums of what's the worst case scenario if we get that wrong, right? So use cases should be used to clarify our risk appetite as we go through the governance cycle and make dispositions on which use cases we want to fund or approve in order for us to deploy or build or engage in a vendor, to procure that AI solution, right? Use cases also inform our governance design, right? So as you go through standing up your lifecycle governance framework and getting use cases through that gauntlet, each time will bring an efficiency of scale, right? It will be a little different and difficult the first couple of times, but over time, organizations gain muscle, and the governance design and governance speed and velocity will increase as you go through more use cases. Use cases can also standardize control patterns, right? So it's beginning to identify key attributes of each use case that can be used for future implementations. So when I say control patterns, that can be things such as data pipelines, right? If we begin with one use case that leverages a specific data source and we go through the data security, data cleansing process to make it AI ready, if we have other use cases down the stream that utilize those same data pipelines, we can reuse that, right? Each new project or each new AI solution doesn't need to start from scratch. So as we get more use cases, we see data control patterns, popping up. At the same time, from an AI technical build perspective, right? If we're building chatbots or predictive models or new engagement solutions, different blueprints or capabilities from a technology perspective can also be replicated and sped up for future subsequent use cases. So the use case, by documenting all these different things, give us control patterns down the line for our 5th, 10th, 15th use case that goes through our life cycle. And then obviously with each one, we build institutional capability, right? The goal is to get them to production once we get approved. But the goal doesn't need to be to keep them on in production. And I think that this is a key area where organizations are still struggling. They want to say, we have 10 use cases in production right now. These are the results. We have 15, we have 20. It's not about the quantity of AI solutions that are in your production environment. It's really having the right ones on and maintaining those and keeping those turned on, because some of these are not going to pan out to what we expected from a return on investment. And that's okay. Like, we're learning with each incremental use case that gets into production, and that's where we'll build our institutional muscle. The image on the right there kind of conveys or visualizes key considerations when you think about, like, what do I need to document around my use case idea, right? And this one's an example of a customer support agent, customer support co-pilot. And this is just representative of key factors or things you may want to document or append to the use case as it goes through the governance lifecycle, right? We talked about intent, like what's the problem it's trying to solve, right? How is it aligned to our strategic goals, right? Risk profile, you can use t-shirt size, 3 values, five values, depending on your organization. But how risky is it, right? What is the impact if we get it wrong or if things go awry? Expected value, kind of what's the ROI projected to be? How is it going to improve the organization's efficiency or strategic goals? Targeted workflow, so that from a business process perspective, we can break down and see interdependencies of other workflows where it may have a great return, but it's so interconnected to other workflows that aren't AI ready yet that it may bring down the profile and make it too complex for us to pursue at this point. Compliance considerations, success metrics, KPIs, adoption readiness. This is very important as far as who are going to be the end users and stakeholders who are going to consume and use this. Are they open to the idea of beginning to leverage AI tools, right? You want to start off with a user group that is, actually excited about using it, right? And that starts with bringing them along, like I said, from the beginning of the lifecycle governance framework as well. And then obviously data readiness, right? We need to go after use cases, the initial ones, where our data is manageable, right? All of our enterprises have data remediation that needs to happen. The good news with AI is that you don't need to boil the ocean and fix everything before you get started, right? By targeting specific use cases and breaking them down into this kind of granularity, you can target certain data sources and create AI-ready data pipelines that you can leverage downstream. Okay, so that is the use case as a control event, and we go through that just to make sure it all starts with that before we enter the actual lifecycle governance framework. All right, and then when we talk about use cases, this is just a summary of some of the high level areas where we're seeing usage and exploration around AI for healthcare use cases, right? Clinical decision support, right? Augmenting, reducing time to get some of those real-time recommendations, as well as diagnostic assistance, the entire prior authorization kind of workflow and processes, right? How do we automate some of that? How do we identify what areas are still missing before we get that authorization? Revenue cycle management, right? That's very kind of financially driven, right? As far as coding and modeling, and from a billing perspective, that's an area that always pops up as a possible high ROI, right? If we're able to put AI solutions and predictive analytics around automating that and kind of cutting down the manual hours, right? How can that get us faster to revenue and outstanding bills? Patient engagement, right? How do we interact with our patients? How do we schedule with them? How do we take intake visits? All the paperwork that we've now digitized. How do we, create more automation and give time back to our clinicians and our staff to focus on more value add work, right? And administrative and operations, right? Back office. So this is very, very prevalent. Oracle has different AI scribing solutions. Other EHRs are beginning to roll that out as well. But, automating efficiency use cases, staffing optimization, supply chain management, ordering of supplies. And at the bottom half here, you see that there's still kind of considerations, even though different health systems and providers are exploring these things, there's certain feedback we're all already seeing from the field, right? So on the clinical decision support, for example, the solution may work great, but false positives kill adoption, right? When you're in a space that relies on, like I said, the specialized expertise, the solution may be right a majority of the times, but as soon as you see a false positive or something that's wrong, it immediately kills user adoption, right? So we need to be ready and make sure we've done the right training and testing to get it to a point where our end users think it's reliable and they want to use it. Otherwise, it's just wasted investment. At the same time, we've also heard of kind of new vendors coming in and providing some of these solutions, but it's not integrated into a easy to use interface or an existing, EHR aspect or window, right? So clinicians and staff are having to go into different browsers. The experience is fragmented, right? And when you're talking about a space like healthcare and patient engagement and patient, clinician work, time is of the essence. We don't have time to be flipping through 15 different windows. There's already enough systems in that workflow, right? So we've heard from pain points as far as we get more mature AI solutions, how can we embed that in the tools we already have, right? And then just a few other comments here on kind of patient engagement as far as the training aspect of it, right? Change management. So as we roll out some of these patient-facing tools, how do we make sure our staff is aware of how it's interacting with the patients? What does that mean from a training perspective, as well as just legal obligations around patient communication disclosures or anything new when we're introducing AI capabilities. Now, we've actually put these use cases on the spectrum of from a risk appetite perspective or risk complexity, starting off with complex on the left to low risk on the right, which is why you probably see a lot more of your peers and organizations beginning to look at administrative and back office efficiency AI use cases versus going too deep into clinical decision support, because that has, obviously higher impacts and negative connotations if the outputs are wrong, right? So it really depends on your organization's risk appetite of where you focus your energy when it comes to AI use cases, but being aware of knowing what are the right questions to ask and then documenting those in an AI use case card so that your governance committee can evaluate it. And that card kind of lives on as you go through the AI lifecycle framework and understand, all the different considerations that need to go before it hits production. All right, so I've alluded to it before, kind of the AI lifecycle, right? You can think of it as just, how do we get from idea, inception, all the way into something that's actually in the production world and being used by health systems, clinicians, and staff, right? There is no perfect science to it, right? We've seen best practices. Most organizations probably have it around 4 phases, right? For today's presentation, we're presenting it in 4 phases. That's what we've implemented mostly throughout different organizations across industries. But depending on the culture of the org, sometimes this could be as narrow as 3 phases to 7, right? It really just depends how you want to break down the work and the governance and the entry and exit criteria as you go through it. But at the end of the day, it's an end-to-end process on managing AI solutions, right? Like I mentioned, it needs to be fit for purpose, right? So no cookie cutter best case or worst case answer. It's whatever makes sense for your organization. And as you go through, we're going to go through each phase here and talk about key things that we need to be aware of and controls we need to start building, right? One thing to note is that this framework was built upon kind of the traditional AI solution around LLMs and Gen AI, right? We all know and recognize that AI is going to continue to evolve and transform as a technology, right? And as that happens, these phases will also change, right? The discussions that we have through each phase will change. So we're seeing that now going from kind of predictive analytics to Gen AI, and now Gen AI to agentic. Depending where you are and what your portfolio of AI solutions look like, these phases may have additional considerations, right? So I just want to put that out there. The third bullet in the center of the screen talks about how the industry is moving when we think about AI solutions, right? Like a year ago, 2 years ago, the rage was, LLMs, large language models, right? Let's pick the best one or build our own, right? And train it on our data. What we've seen the market and technology do now is that the LLM, for all intents and purposes, is a lot more interchangeable than we thought, right? And as you get deeper into kind of what's changing with the layout and the considerations of AI solutions, we're getting around this concept that you may have heard of the harness, right? Securing your harness and designing your harness is kind of the new buzzword when you think about kind of building your governance and risk management program. So it's no longer like which model we're going to use and where's it going to sit. As we get into agentic AI solutions, it's all right, how do we protect the AI solution and put all these things around the harness from a data perspective, from a monitoring perspective, from a policy as code, from a cyber perspective, so that we bubble wrap the AI solution with all these different mechanisms and components that they're calling the harness. So it's a little bit more for kind of like, more mature organizations, but something to think through or be aware of, because as you mature your programs, that's definitely where the market is going, and it should be accounted for in your governance frameworks. All right, so let's start off with phase 1, right? And the use cases, like I said, was kind of like the starting point, right? So someone at the organization or leadership has an idea, we create and document the use case card, right? In the initiation phase is where we make a disposition of, okay, is this something that we want to move forward with, right? So we need to come up with the use case risk classification, right? And there's different factors that you can come up with or rules based off your organization to determine a risk level to that, right? At this point, we should also begin to identify accountability, right? Who's going to own it? If it's clinician impacting, is it the head of a clinical department? If it's back office, is it someone on the supply chain manager? Begin to identify those owners and accountability roles from the beginning. Data governance and lineage assessment, right? What data is this AI solution going to use? What is the state of that data, right? Is it been kind of fine-tuned or governed to really break down, at the semantic layer, as well as providing enough context for the AI solution, right? All of these different use cases are going to require some type of data remediation to get them AI ready, right? And there should be a whole separate process on what that actually entails. But we need to at least do a high level assessment to begin to see what that level of work might be so that when we approve things and are comparing different use cases, we can make an educated, decision on that. And then obviously risk appetite and control design, right? So what will monitoring look like? What's explainability requirements? What is the expected ROI? Do we have a monitoring tool to monitor this? Are we going to have staff, net promoter score? Thinking through all of these things, even though it will be, it'll be a living exercise, right? As we go through each phase, you may refine it a bit, but these are key questions that we should be answering from the start so that we can get to a disposition and either go into a backlog or move on to the next phase. And like I said, right now, these are just kind of a representative list of some of the key things to think about from an initiation phase. As you implement this in your organization, we see a certain set of templates and exit criteria, official approvals that need to happen, and your AI governance committees will review these at the end of the gate and make a disposition, right? Approve, not now, defer, whatever the values are specific to your org. But it all starts with the first phase. All right, next phase, design and build. And this is an area where we've seen some organizations that are more mature and want to be very pragmatic. Maybe they have a design phase and a build phase. We've seen other people combine the two. It really depends on preference. But now that we've taken the main exit criteria from the initiation phase and we know what we want to build, we need to solve the biggest question of how we're going to build that, right? And that's solution design and architecture. A lot of organizations make a mistake of trying to solution too much upfront without thinking through all the things we covered in initiation, right? Everyone's hearing agentic AI, agentic AI. Leadership sometimes just says, give me the agentic AI solution. But that may not be necessary, right? And that's why we need to go back to the fundamentals of, okay, what is the business case or what is the use case we're trying to solve here? It may not need agentic AI in order to get to that expected outcome. Predictive analytics, conventional AI, or even generative AI may be a reasonable design. So we shouldn't begin to fully flush out or come to a solutioning decision until we're in this design and build phase where we have an approved business context in the use case that we can then go into kind of architecture discussions. And when I say solution design and architecture, from this phase also, like if you're working in a vendor environment and you don't have development resources, this is also a phase that could be kind of more vendor management driven, right? By saying, okay, we don't have those enhanced capabilities. Let's go to a solution provider and they can build it for us. Or we've identified this third-party software that does this specific workflow that we've approved. Let's go procure that. But for intensive purposes, this is meant to convey kind of if you had those internal capabilities. Model development standards, right? We don't want to have a team or group of developers just being very wild, wild west, right? We're at a point now where coding and developer productivity, for the most part, has stabilized a bit, where there shouldn't be 10 different developers using 10 different programming languages and there's no consistency, right? We should have standardized repos, standardized CI/CD pipelines, standardized development standards to make sure that all these solutions are being built consistently so that inevitably when we do have to refine and fine tune them or modify them, we can do that regardless of who worked on it originally, right? Bias and fairness testing, especially in the healthcare industry, is very important. So we need to make sure that during the initial building phase, we're testing to see what the outputs are and if there's any indication that we might have bias and fairness drifting. And then from a documentation perspective, kind of, what is the model card of the AI solution we're building, right? Model card is very similar to kind of the concept of our AI use case card, right? The next iteration that people are even talking about now is like a system card where you get into agentic AI solutions. There's been some guidance around promoting like nutrition label information around AI solutions to give everyone kind of like a quick look of the key components of which LLM it's being driven by, what data it's being used by, is the human in the loop. So key consideration factors around your AI solution so that if someone ever asks like, oh, that patient engagement chatbot, right? What's behind that? And you can show them your model card, your model nutrition label, and it'll say, oh, it's being powered by Claude, has these two data sources, human in the loop is definitely there, and it's only being rolled out to these two states for now. Okay, great. The original frontier model providers, like OpenAI, Google, they have model card documentation that's publicly available, but they're sometimes they can span up to like 70 pages, right? So how do we make a more digestible model card or documentation as we enter this gate? Is a goal that you can come up with at your organization. But having some type of documentation of what you've just built and standardize that across the organization is definitely a best practice. Deployment phase, like I said, governance committee review, definitely. Like the governance committee has been throughout each phase. It hasn't been explicitly called out, but this is kind of like one of the key mandates that they would do, right? Nothing should go live without kind of a final governance committee review. From a regulatory perspective, right? We're in an evolving landscape where every week some new framework, some new guidance comes out. So right before making sure that there is some compliance validation that nothing new has come out since we started the project to make sure that we're not in violation. Deployment controls, access policy, and then go live checklists, right? So all very much standard, different things that need to be accounted for and documented before we put something in production. And in the traditional IT world, like this usually represents the last step, right? We got to production, it's in there, and now we're in a break fix mode, we fix defects. Unfortunately, with AI, it's not that simple anymore, right? Getting to the deployment phase sometimes is easier than then navigating the next phase, which is the monitoring phase. And that's where we make some of the most important decisions as well as see some of the more real world examples of what these AI solutions are doing, right? So with that, we need to make sure that we're increasing our reporting, transparency, visibility of those AI solutions in production. So we need to have performance monitoring, audit trail and logging, incidents response and escalation, as well as kind of a reconvening on a scheduled time frame for the governance review to say, hey, this is how it's performing. We've identified this data drift. From a technology perspective, new models come out. We're going to upgrade it to that. And even from a business perspective to say, okay, like it's been on for 90 days. Like what are the real world results and outcomes that it's deriving because it's costing us X number of dollars a month, right? One thing we haven't touched a lot on that I think is something very important, to think about going forward is the financial management cost of AI solutions, right? Right now, as the technology evolves, it's going to require more compute, right? And tokens, as you may have heard of them, right? So you don't want to create something that is very token heavy and being used in production all the time and consuming all those resources because it's going to rack up the bill unless you don't have the proper financial management controls in your cloud environment. If you have an on-prem environment, sometimes that stabilizes the cost, but you still need to be monitoring that aspect as well. Typically a more mature concept, right, as you get going here, but something I want to put in your ear. It's FinOps, kind of financial management of AI solutions. That's becoming an increasing term and gaining a lot of traction of how do we manage this cost aspect, because we do know that as the technology gets better and the complexity increases, that those costs will also increase, right? And we need to be prepared for that down the line. All right, so that was the final phase, monitoring. And in this phase, you make dispositions, right? Like I said before, some AI use cases will live on in production for months, years. Others will turn off and shut them down within 90 days and give those resources to the next use case, right? It's about making sure we're making the right business decisions based off the returns we're seeing, right? So, and that doesn't always have to be monetary or financially driven, right? Like from a patient engagement perspective, if there's a new solution that the patients and those end users love, and maybe it is costing us or we're breaking even, it's something we keep on for that patient experience win, because that's something that the organization really cares about, right? So however you define value, whether that's monetary, staff, human resource experience, that value equation should be reviewed in the monitoring phase. So we just walked through kind of the four phases of what an AI lifecycle governance framework might look like, right? And the whole point of that was, as you get these different ideas or are being thrust into different solutions that people are pitching to you, you can go through that life cycle with a very pragmatic view. And whether you're building it on your own or going with a vendor, ask these questions and require that documentation. And then when you get it in production, make sure you're thinking about these things to make a decision of if you renew it, if you keep investing it, and so forth. Um, Fortunately, that's not the only, you know, swim lane when we talk about AI risk management, right? There's still other things around, um, ethical aspects of our AI solutions, kind of our third-party vendor management program, human enablement, right, around kind of training and change management. So, we present this slide to show you kind of, in addition to the AI lifecycle governance framework, right, when you talk about managing AI with a risk management program, you should be aware of what the market's looking like for level one, level two, level three maturity, right? So having a policy, having a model inventory, having a committee, um, having a lifecycle governance framework, like all of those are becoming now table stakes for 2026, right? If you don't have those four things, you're behind. So at minimum, you need to get your house in order and just stick with keeping up with what's going to be coming down the line around regulatory requirements and explainability and audit trails of your controls to make sure at minimum you have maturity level one, right? So that's the first horizon there you see. Maturity level two is now that you've have your initial framework up and running, you're learning from it, you're seeing what's working and what's not working from a risk review perspective, from a production perspective. You can then begin to introduce kind of automated tools that will make the governance aspect more real time. We're seeing that with kind of model lifecycle management, right? How do we build these things in a more automated and rollback fashion? The concept of policy as code, right? Instead of maturity level one, relying on manual team members to look over things or give compliance checks, we're now introducing more automated solutions and controls that can do that in real time. And the reason why that's being needed to be accelerated, back to my earlier point, is the rise of agentic AI solutions, right? They're taking data every second if you give them the rights to, right? And we need to have real-time detection to make sure they're only accessing what we want them to access. So as you get into agentic AI and more complex AI solutions, you're going to need to increase your monitoring capabilities, introduce concepts like policy as code from a data provisioning perspective, from a data drift perspective, as well as from fairness metrics, right? And the maturity level three is now you have an environment, an ecosystem with automated tools that are working to patrol and govern the AI and also using AI to monitor AI, right? And we have more investment in kind of a full-blown ecosystem view, right? Not just like what these 5 use cases are doing, but what's the entire stack doing, right? And how are they performing, both from a risk perspective, governance perspective, financial management, and so forth. So none of these things happen overnight. It's not like it'll be dire straits if it's not figured out by the end of the year. But like I said, most people right now are maturity level one. Like, let's get the concepts and the frameworks up and running, still trusting humans to do a majority of the work. Maturity level two is like, hey, we're actually invested now. We have an AI governance team. They can look at more things in the granular level. They've begun to procure more governance related software to improve the audit trail, deploy policy as code, and then eventually, get up to mature level three. So with that maturity and agentic AI is also now another convergence of cybersecurity, right? And I think a lot of this was really thrust into the headlines 2 months ago with the announcement of Anthropic and the Mythos model, as far as how it was able to identify and automate a lot of security vulnerabilities, right? So cybersecurity, old way of thinking, right? Penetration testing, kind of posture on an annual basis or quarterly basis, no longer is relevant when it comes to AI solutions, and even more so with agentic AI, right? The same way I was talking about policy as code and real-time monitoring, that's how we need to begin to integrate cybersecurity into our AI conversations, right? AI is great. It can give us, great capabilities within our org, but at the same time, bad threat actors can do the same, leverage the same tools to do harm to us, right? So in some aspects, we need to have AI combating AI, and that's having cybersecurity in these conversations as we're designing and deploying new production use cases. From a data perspective, right, depending on agents pulling data from certain things, if something is compromised in the data pipeline, that creates PHI exposure. So we need to have the right controls and mechanisms that turn off any data requests as soon as we identify something shouldn't be happening, that is. Real-time risk scoring, right? No longer let's wait till the audit, let's wait till the assessment or bringing in the cyber guys, like having real-time risk scoring of what's being pulled, what the agent is doing, needs to become kind of a consideration as you build out your program. And then, like I mentioned on the earlier slide, kind of continuous monitoring and observability, right? One of the frameworks released by Glean, Databricks, and Palo Alto Networks is an aware framework, right? It begins to talk about how you might manage agentic AI solutions, right? And these are some of the key concepts of that. At the same time, we can't forget about industry standards, right? So when it comes to AI risk management frameworks, right, NIST AI, RMF, and ISO 42001 are still kind of the leading guidance frameworks, right? But on the healthcare side, there are different guidance and regulations popping up around clinical decision support, kind of fairness and ethics, as well as AI being used in software as medical devices. So keeping up with changes in these as you're going through the AI lifecycle framework is also important, like I said, because things are changing on a weekly basis. All right, so now that we've gone through all that and you take that back to your organization and start to make some inroads, this is kind of some barometer checks of kind of like what good AI governance will look like, if you follow these best practices, right? Anyone ask anything about production AI solutions or systems, right? You have a lot more documentation than you used to have, right? Model cards, approval decision trails, assigned owners and accountability, right? You know why that solution's there. It's not a mystery, right? A governance committee that's constantly informed throughout the life cycle, right? So they can explain why deployment decisions were made, why things were turned off, and it's audit ready in case auditors or other regulators come in and start asking questions, right? You're following the best practice of keeping up with industry guidance, right? Every time something comes out from the ONC or CMS, within 30 days, 45 days, there is a periodic process where someone on your governance team is making sure that there are no changes or applicable AI, impacts that maybe need to change how we're governing some of these solutions. Audit risk and compliance, they're thrust into the cross-functional conversations, right? The old days of solutions just being business and IT can't exist anymore, right? We need to have risk, compliance, cyber, all those stakeholders in those discussions to make sure we're not missing anything. And then finally, you're seeing velocity. Like I said, standing all this stuff up and getting all the players on board is going to take work, right? I mean, humans by nature do not like change and it's hard to adapt. But as you go through the mechanism and the life cycle, you will see gains in velocity and learn new things, as well as begin to build up your assets around data pipelines, AI technology components, and how you evaluate risk profiles. So in closing, like I said, these are best practices. Hopefully this has been helpful as far as how you might consider evolving or updating your AI governance frameworks. This is something you can utilize whether you have 0 use cases or 5 or 10. And like I said, it's a living thing, right? People who don't have anything, when we go in and implement this, we always say it's a version 0, version 1. It's going to continue to evolve, right? It's not static. It's the new nature that we're in. Remember, like our industry has very critical impacts and consequences if we get this wrong. So it's important to lean heavily on the governance and risk management side to avoid being in the headlines for anything that goes awry. And then always just reframing, governance should be utilized as an accelerant to this process. We're not here to slow things down. Studies have shown that people who have robust governance frameworks actually are better off in the long term with deploying their solutions and just their organizational velocity. So that is all we had. We'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any follow-ups after that we don't get to, these are the emails for me and Zach. You can feel free to reach out to us at Wolf&Co, and we'd be happy to talk.
Perfect. And Nilsson, we actually have one question, but it's in the webinar chat.
Okay, let me see.
And then just as a note, Nilsson, if you want, I can read it out loud. The rest of the attendees cannot see the question, so it might be helpful.
Oh, okay, sure.
So their question was, with new models changing, this person is wondering if they're correct in stating that the entire AI lifecycle framework needs to be followed to validate the new model procedures, or what the model produces results that compare to previous models. They've heard instances where agent handoffs break with the new model versions.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that goes back to kind of the model interchangeability, right? So let's say you design something, ChatGPT 4 at the design phase. That's what you decided to move forward with. It gets into production. Next month, it goes into a different release. Or you find that a different benchmarking study is different, and now you want to swap out Claude for that, right? You should go through the lifecycle governance framework of changing anything in that design in production and testing it before the new one gets deployed and swapped. But that's very common, right? I mean, it's very rare that someone is keeping a static LLM version throughout the solution. And that's why, I mean, you'll have to test it, obviously, to see what other ramifications from a drift perspective or what the outputs are looking like. But that's becoming more commonplace to optimize the LLM that's being used in some of these solutions once it's in production. So as long as you have a governed process of how you're going to do that and a rollback plan, that shouldn't be an issue.
Very nice. Thank you. And thank you for that question. Please feel free. I know we have about 6 minutes left in this webinar series, so if you have any questions, please feel free to put them. You can use the chat too, but if you could put them in the Q&A section, we can answer them on today's webinar. I will do a closing note just while we wait for any future. Oh, as I'm speaking, another question comes through. Okay, Nelson, our next question is, do you have different approval pathways or maintenance expectations for different AI product tiles? LLM versus other products, for example?
Yes, I think we need to treat AI as its own kind of track of how you evaluate the approval pathway and maintenance, right? So some organizations tried out like just bundling, an AI or LLM path within their traditional IT processes, right? And what we're seeing, there's so many different permutations within the AI track that it's getting out of control, right? So we should definitely have different dispositions, rollback plans, continuity plans, approval mechanisms of how we're treating AI solutions, whether that's LLM or even AI infused in vendor solutions versus traditional products.
Thank you, and fantastic question, Brett. All right, as we give everyone a minute, I did have a couple closing notes. Again, please be on the lookout for a survey regarding today's webinar. We'll also be posting a recording of today's webinar to our New England HIMSS YouTube channel and posting the link to the video on our socials. So specifically, LinkedIn is where you can look out for that. And lastly, just to know, I know Nilsson ended on it, but if you have any additional information, questions, tidbits of information you want to share with Nilsson or ask him, please feel free to reach out to both Nilsson and Zach directly on the emails on the screen. All right, and feel free, if you guys are all set, feel free to drop. If you have any questions, I'll be on though for the next 3 minutes until this closes out. Thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.